part of our goal, part of our hope here during the holidays, is that we can offer, for those who are with us during this time, some sense of uplift, some sense of real hope. I believe there is reason, and I hope that you will understand that as you experience these holidays with us. So I want to begin with an unusual way. I want to begin with a poem from an Israeli poet who was a survivor from the Holocaust, who lost most of his family, including his grandparents, his parents, his little sister, and some of his poems reflect that. But here is a man who suffered enormously, named Tuvia Rubner, and who learned to write in a foreign language. His native language, was German, and he learned to write beautiful poetry in Hebrew. And he wrote this remarkable poem for a man who grew up where he grew up and experienced what he experienced. It's called Olam Mufla, A Wondrous World. I want to share it with you at the beginning and hope that during these holidays you will come to see the world with more hope, more light, and more joy as we enter 5775. Even if you find 1,000 reasons to protest, the world is wondrous. Say, we are born to die, what wickedness, but until then, what a wondrous world. Wondrous in what it reveals and what it conceals. Wondrous in its creation day after day, and wondrous in its destruction night after night. In the sun breaking through the chilled, thin skin of dawn, and in its setting in all the rainbow colors. Wondrous that you wake up alive in the morning, and wondrous that your body has reached this illustrious age. Wondrous that the teeth of the predator fasten precisely on the flesh of his prey, and blessing and curse embrace each other. The first rain, already in early September, like a wall of air, isn't that wondrous? And you've seen how the ladybug, a wondrous lady, there's no denying, climbed to the top of a hyacinth as though she ascended the peak of El Capitan in Yosemite, or the northern wall of the Eiger in the Bernese Alps, and didn't lose even a single spot from off her back. Isn't it wondrous how clumps of fire and ice from 1 trillion years ago peek at you like the eyes of actors through a hole in the backstage curtain, sparkling and sparkling, and wondrous, wondrous that from out of the earth burst forth slender green stalks that in the end will be bread that you and I eat on the edge of a knife. Ha'olam mufla, the world is wondrous.
Shiru מלכנו, חטאנו לפניך, אבינו מלכנו, חמול עלינו, ועלול עלינו, ותפנו. Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Kodseinu, Besefer Chaim Tovim, Avinu Malkeinu, Hatesh Aleinu, Hatesh Aleinu, Shana Tova. Avinu Malkeinu, Shema Koleinu, Shema Koleinu, Shema Koleinu.
Shana Tova to all of you. Growing up, I went to Everglades Elementary School in Miami, Florida. And like every other child growing up in the United States at that time, we recited the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. You know it. Say it with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. But here's what's different about the way I recited it. At the end of reciting the pledge, I would whisper under my breath, Amen. I guess I was heading to rabbinical school even back then. So I did this, I said Amen under my breath, because for me, it felt more like a prayer than a declaration. I knew, even at the tender age of 9 or 10, that justice for all was an aspiration and not a reality. It felt disingenuous for me to recite those words without acknowledging that. I knew that boys and girls were treated differently. I knew that the color of one's skin mattered. And I knew that the luck of our birth circumstances often shaped our future. And so, when I recited the pledge, I punctuated it with a prayer. From that moment till now, much has changed, thankfully. The rise of feminism has enabled someone like me, a woman, to be your rabbi. And affirmative action has ultimately led to our first African American president. But in some ways, time stands still. You know, boys and girls are still treated differently. The color of one's skin does still matter, and the luck of one's birth circumstances may still shape someone's future. It's been many years, but the words justice for all remain an aspiration. So this past year, our congregation has been doing a lot of thinking about how we can make justice for all more than an aspiration, how we can transform it into action. So I've had meetings with many of you and spoken to you about this idea. And in those meetings, the question I often asked was, what keeps you up at night? Or what social justice issue would get you up on a Sunday morning to take action? So many people were surprised by the question, and often the response was silence. But in a little while, the conversation expanded. And I learned that many of you are concerned about public education and, of course, the well-being of your children. Others mentioned the rising waters on Miami Beach. A few talked about the scourge of gun violence, and others about how obscene it is that there are children in our country who go to bed hungry. Ultimately, there are many things that distress us, but without a real sense of urgency, without a sense of personal responsibility, we are informed citizens. We are people who care. But we get so caught up in our own day-to-day concerns, our own personal struggles, that it's as if we're living in a bubble. You know, many years ago, my family and I attended an interfaith gathering at Bayfront Park. And throughout the ceremonies, there was a drunk man that was disturbing us. And so afterwards, my daughters had a few choice words for me for bringing them there at night. And I was trying to find the silver lining in this situation, and so I said to my daughter, Hannah, who was 10 years old at the time and went to a Jewish day school, I said to her, you know, it's good for you to get out of your insulated bubble every once in a while. And Hannah replied, but I love my bubble. You know, we do. We love our beautiful bubbles. There is a story from our tradition about a man on a boat with other travelers when he starts drilling a hole under his seat. The others try to stop him. What are you doing? They cry. The man keeps drilling. It's not any of your business, he tells them. The hole is under my seat. But when the waters begin to flood the boat, they shout, you will flood the boat for all of us. What happens when we only look out for ourselves? We all drown. The philosopher Martin Buber wrote that we have to start with ourselves, but we cannot end with ourselves. We are all interconnected, all responsible for each other. In ancient times, when the temple stood in Jerusalem, the high priest had a grave task every Yom Kippur. It was upon him to confess the people's sins to God and make restitution on their behalf. He was the only person to ever enter into the Holy of Holies, and only on this one day a year, on Yom Kippur. So before entering, he would first offer atonement for himself, and then for his family and tribe, and finally for the whole community of Israel. These offerings represented the circles of people for whom he was responsible as high priest. And though today we no longer have that temple or the Holy of Holies or the high priest, the notion of these circles of responsibility still resonates with us. We first start with ourselves, our families. That makes sense. We take care of each other at home. We feed each other, provide shelter, make sure there's education and well-being. And just as the high priest first took care of himself and his family, that's what we do. It's natural for us to put our needs and the needs of our family before others. It makes sense. But as Buber says, we cannot end there. Like the high priest, our next circle of responsibility is our tribe or our community. We are all members of multiple groups, schools, organizations, businesses, clubs, and of course, our beloved synagogue. Many of us are involved in parent-teacher organizations and civic leadership. We serve meals at homeless shelters and coach our kids' teams. We take care of each other at temple in myriad ways. We show up for Shiva minions. We visit the sick. We offer rides to temple, and we create wonderful mitzvah projects. But should our responsibility end there? What about our national community? Isn't that also part of our circle of responsibility? Shouldn't we be concerned about the safety and education not only of our own children, but of all the children in our country? Remember how you felt after the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School and the fear of knowing that that could happen anywhere? And what about the swells of children who fled their homes this summer and risked their lives trying to enter into our country? You know, it wasn't so long ago that Jewish children fled for their lives in kinder transports during World War II. So the high priest's final offering was on behalf of all of his people, even those he didn't know. What is our third circle of responsibility? For some, it is a particularistic concern of the Jewish people. The Talmud teaches us, Kol Yisrael arevim ze lezeh. All of Israel are responsible for each other. We think of Jews as mishpacha, as family, and we think of Israel as our Jewish home. That's why many of us marched to free Soviet Jews, or we sent money to rescue Ethiopian Jews. And that's why this summer we were glued to any kind of news we could get about Israel, why we prayed for the 3 missing boys and became conversant about the marvels of the Iron Dome. And that's why when 2 lone soldiers in Israel were killed, Sean Carmeli and Max Steinberg, over 30,000 Israelis showed up for their funerals. All of Israel became their family, and we did too. But didn't we also cry for the Palestinian boy, Mohammed Abu Qadar, who was brutally murdered by extremists? Didn't our hearts break also for those innocent children in Gaza who were pawns in a war? Our circles of obligation, my friends, cannot end with only particularistic concerns. You know, in ancient times, the high priest lived in a much smaller world than we do. There was no New York Times or CNN or Instagram or NPR, not even Twitter. Rabbi Daniel Groper suggests that given how our world has changed since the time of the high priest, we need to consider a 4th circle of obligation. Now that Google Maps connects us to any region in the world and satellite images are beamed right into our living rooms, isn't the whole world our backyard? Over a decade ago, some women and I gathered for a Rosh celebration where we learned about how the women in Afghanistan were being oppressed by the Taliban, how girls could no longer go to school and women were forced to imprison themselves in burqas. And I remember how at the time it captured our interest, but it seemed so far away, so unrelated to our lives. And then, just a few short months later, it was 9/11, and the planes hit the World Trade Center. And in a heartbeat, it became clear that what happens all the way across the world can knock us flat right here. We are all in the boat together. Not just our families, not just our synagogue or Miami Beach or our country, the whole entire world. What happens in Afghanistan affects New York. What happens in Syria affects Miami. This summer, I had the curious experience of traveling halfway across the world to meet my daughter's Zulu mama. So a few years ago, our daughter Hannah lived for a semester in a Zulu village outside of Durban, South Africa. And she was well cared for by her host family. It felt surreal to visit this South African township, to sit in this tiny house with chickens running around outside, and know that our daughter had lived inside these humble walls. And yet, we felt completely connected to these strangers, not just because Hannah's mama treated us to Kentucky Fried Chicken, but because I knew she had taken care of our daughter. She had fed her, watched out for her, included her in their family celebrations. Separated by distance, culture, religion, and economic privilege, our connection as mamas transcended all of it. It really was a privilege to visit somewhere so distant and yet feel so close. But you know, all of us, I know, are related to people all around the world, either in business or in friendship, and we have contact with people all around the world almost every day. I know, for example, that hiding in your jacket pockets or in your purses right now, you have phones that were most likely manufactured in China. And our shoes, if we're lucky, were made in Italy or Spain. The stones from our synagogue came from Jerusalem, and our clothes comes from the four corners of the earth. We engage with the world constantly. But do we feel responsible for each other? Do we care about the well-being of the people who manufactured our phones, or their level of poverty or education? After killing his brother Abel, Adam and Eve's son, Cain, challenges God. Shomer achi anochi, he asks God, am I my brother's keeper? Yes, our tradition says. Yes, you are your brother's keeper. All of us are. We are instructed to care for the orphan, the widow, and the stranger over and over again in the Torah. Our neighbor's pain is our problem. I created you to be a light unto the nations, says God through the prophet Isaiah. I created you to lift up the fallen, to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry, to redeem the oppressed. To be a light unto the nations is a calling from God for God. This is our blueprint for how we are meant to be Jews in this world. We are mandated to get our hands dirty, doing the gritty, holy work that God has called on us to do. We are God's partners, God's allies, and God's friends. You know, to care for one another isn't liberalism or communism or socialism. It is humanism, or I would say it's Judaism. Judaism means taking care of each other in every concentric circle. Sometimes it feels as if our universe is imploding. This summer was oppressive, not just because of the painful conflict in Israel, but there was the civil unrest in Ferguson, Missouri. There was the spread of the Ebola virus in Africa. And there is, of course, the bloodthirsty lunacy of ISIS. So how do we keep from feeling overwhelmed if all of this is part of our responsibility? In the words of Ruth Messenger, who is the president of the American Jewish World Service, we cannot retreat to the convenience of being overwhelmed. The Talmud teaches us to save a single life is to save the entire world. And so we save the world one person at a time, one meal at a time, one pair of shoes, one visit, one phone call, one email, one piece of legislation. It's time to transform aspiration into action. And that's why we at Temple Beth Shalom are creating this exciting new social justice network. Through this network, we'll provide direct service to people in need regularly, not just on our wonderful mitzvah day. You can be part of a team serving foster children or serving food at a homeless shelter or cleaning up the beach or more. You know, hands-on service is a necessity, and it is only one path toward transforming our world. If we want to affect the root causes of problems in our society, then we also have to work through the path of advocacy at local, state, and national levels. Service, advocacy, and action are all important and go hand in hand in transforming our world. You know, there is a vibrancy and a power for people acting together with purpose. We strengthen each other. So at your seats, you will see our brand new Social Justice Network brochure. And I invite you to please look at it and note all the ways that we can make change together. You can attend a pact gathering, an interfaith pact gathering. You can sign up for alerts from the Reform Movement's Religious Action Center, or the RAC as it's called, about issues that are important to you. When the assistant director of the RAC, Mark Pelevin, first started his job there, he called a congressman just to check up and see if they were getting calls on a certain issue. And the legislative aide said to him, "Yes, the phone's been ringing off the hook." And Mark said, "Really?" And the aide said, "Yes, we got 5 or 6 calls today." 5 or 6 calls. That may be all it needs to make a difference. Our Temple Beth Shalom Social Justice Network has chosen to focus our attention this year on the issue of poverty and hunger. There are so many pressing issues in our world, but we chose this one because it is such a basic and urgent necessity. Kathy Fattel, who is a member of our social justice network, made an impassioned presentation urging us with these statistics. 870 million people in the world, or 1 out of 8, are chronically hungry. 5 million children die a year from starvation, which means that 14,000 died today and every day from malnutrition and poverty. 15.9 million children in our country, the United States of America, go to bed hungry. 15.9 million. Kathy concluded her talk with this final thought. As I prepared this presentation, I kept looking at my own family, trying to imagine how I'd feel if it was my 15-year-old son who wasn't going to get a hot meal today just because it's Saturday and there's no school breakfast or lunch. Some of us don't have to worry about where our next meal is coming from, but many people do. You know, it doesn't have to be this way. The world produces enough food to feed everyone. Every Passover, we proclaim, "Let all who are hungry come and eat," but we have to mean it. And if we mean it, then we have to live it, and we have to work for it. This, my friends, is our charge and our challenge for the year. And you all can start by participating in Project Isaiah, our Yom Kippur food drive. Let's make this the largest collection we have ever had at Temple Beth Shalom. So I'm going to ask you to please take a moment to look in your brochures and fill them out as soon as I'm done speaking. Please make a pledge to be part of our team. We want you and we need you. And if you look in the back of your brochure, you'll see a picture of the great Jewish philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel at the far left, marching for civil rights with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Heschel taught, other religions require a leap of faith. Judaism requires a leap of action. We inherit that noble legacy of Jewish activism. 50 years ago this summer, a group of Reform rabbis was arrested in St. Augustine, Florida, marching for civil rights. It was June, and they were attending a rabbinic conference when they received a telegram from Martin Luther King saying, "We need you down here now with as many rabbis as you can bring." And so 16 rabbis stopped what they were doing and heeded Dr. King's call. Today, please heed our urgent call. Make justice for all not something that's aspirational, but operational. The shofar sounds on this holiday to rouse us from our complacency, to ru'ah. Let's answer this call together.